As we live life and as we get older, and I'm there, you develop some philosophies. Sometimes you can put them in words, sometimes you can't. And maybe they're accurate, maybe they're not. I tend to think mine are. I don't know if yours are or not, but one of my observation philosophies is that people usually find what we're looking for in life. I don't know how many times I've heard people tell me why they quit attending church. Lots of times. It usually has to do with something somebody said to them, or something somebody did, or something somebody didn't do. And I don't deny that many of us have been victims of hurtful things, and maybe victims of neglect, selfish, hurtful acts of those in and around the church. But there also may be another side to that story, there usually is, and that is that there is a very real possibility that sometimes we choose to remain victims when we have the opportunity to move on. And it's a waste of our lives. It's a waste of all the blessings and potential that God has put in us individually to fixate on how events of the past could have or should have been different. Many of us have been hurt, and we could probably persuade pretty much any jury of how badly we've been treated and how things should have been different. But the truth is, they're not different. And no amount of time spent dwelling on how another sheep hurt us or how something should have been different is going to change our present situation. And I think about trying to draw some parallel in life. Imagine that you have been shot and you've been rushed to the emergency room. Can you imagine somebody who would refuse to get help because you were so angry at the person who shot you? Or do you think it might be your primary concern to get some help so that you could survive? And it seems to me that with physical hurts, we immediately seek help. But with emotional and spiritual hurt, sometimes it seems like that engenders a response unlike any other wound. We want to nurse it. We want to get it infected. We want it to hurt, all the while denying that we do. When we're shot by people in the church, we tend to focus on the shooter and not the healer. And so a couple of things, observations. If we find ourselves anywhere in any situation similar to this is one of our enemy's most effective distraction strategies. He knows that help is available, but he doesn't want us to get it. Satan would have us forget also that being broken is a necessary part of God's plan for our growth. There are some things in our life that need to be broken. There are some hurts that we need to endure in our life, as unpleasant as that may sound. And you've heard me say before, and you've heard other people, it's certainly not original with me, that the same sun that melts wax hardens clay. Same incident in one person's life will melt their heart, and it will harden somebody else's heart. make them angry and hostile. You remember the Apostle Paul talked about how he begged God to remove his affliction. And then he came to an important realization after he'd had a conversation with God. God talked to him about it. He just kept on pressing the issue until God talked to him about it. And I want to read it from a paraphrase. All right, a paraphrase is kind of like reading a brief commentary. So let me read you his response from a Bible that is called The Message. It is a paraphrase. And I'm reading from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. Paul speaking. And then he told me, my grace is enough. It's all you need. My strength comes into its own in your weakness. Once I heard that, Paul said, I was glad to let it happen. I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in on my weakness. Paul quit focusing on his handicap. And that action was what is absolutely necessary for his recovery, just like it is ours. That we quit nursing that hurt. We quit focusing in on the hurt that has happened to us so that God can begin to heal us. But sadly, many of us get to that point and we just decide to stop functioning. And we get to that point of resignation, and we're right at the point where God would heal us and make us stronger, but we quit. And we decide to pitch our tent here. And this is where we keep coming back to and keep coming back to and keep reminding ourselves of it. How can we learn to allow our wounds to heal rather than to fester and to cripple us? So I've got a couple of suggestions tonight. And it's about letting go of victimhood. It seems to me that we live in a society in which everybody wants to be a victim. And so let's establish one thing first of all, and I want to see a show of hands. Is there anybody here that has not been hurt by something that someone said or someone did? If there is, I want you to raise your hand. Well, I'm sure the camera didn't span the audience, but nobody raised their hand. So unless we're just super shy and wouldn't raise our hand, then that means we're all hurt. We have all been hurt by something somebody said. And we feel like that's something that somebody said or something that somebody did or didn't do was unfair. And so the first thing we need to know is we're all in the same boat with this thing. Everybody has been hurt by something that someone said. Paul reminded the Corinthian Christians in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, no temptation, and the same word can be translated trial, has seized you except what is common to man. You're not experiencing anything that others have not experienced. In fact, in this case, you're not experiencing anything that everybody else who's an adult, let's at least put it that way, and you don't have to be very old for somebody to have said something to hurt you. And so if we want to deal with the hurt that we've experienced, the first thing we need to do is accept the truth that everybody's been hurt. You're not unique in that. It's kind of like somebody wanting to show you their scars. You ever had that happen to you? It's not your favorite thing, right? And so the first thing that we need to do is establish that everybody has been hurt. And we don't want to hear that when we've been hurt. And then the second thing is we need to get beyond the victim mentality. In the Gospel of John, we see an example of how Jesus asked a seeker to leave his woundedness behind. And it's something that we've talked about before, and so it's not new, but it's one of those things that just fascinates me. Jesus knew, it's in John chapter 5, and Jesus knew when he saw this man that his affliction had become his identity. It's how he saw himself. It's how he portrayed himself to others. He was a wounded, helpless victim. And you know the story. John chapter 5, verse 1, sometime later, and this would be the second Passover of Jesus' public ministry, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the feast of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, that translates house of mercy, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. And you know the story. And you know probably the application that I'm going to make. Jesus, for whatever reason, out of all these people that are here, all these sick, diseased people, there was one man that caught his attention. I don't know why. I don't know why it was this particular man. Maybe it was because he had been afflicted for so long, and Jesus knew that. But he came up to him, and he stopped, and he looked at him, and he said, "Do you want to get well?" Now, you know the story. But I'm still fascinated by Jesus asking that question. And I think the man's answer may provide an insight into the reason that Jesus asked that question. And you remember, it's like a good friend of mine always used to say about a particular congregation. He said, they just have a bad case of the can't help it's. God is not going to force himself on any of us, regardless of how obviously we need him. We have to know that. And we have to want his help and desire his help. And we have to make a decision that we want to receive the healing that Jesus offers. This man had apparently embraced victimhood for 38 long years, and he had adjusted his life and his attitude to it. So when Jesus asked him the question, the man launched into what I would call victim speak. He said, when Jesus said, "Do you want to get well?" he didn't answer his question. He began to tell of all the problems. He began to show his scars. He began to tell him why he was in the situation. And instead of answering, he said, "Sir, when the water is stirred, I don't have anybody to put me in the pool, and by the time I get there, somebody else is already in it." He wouldn't answer the question. And I find that really interesting. And I think that he didn't because he didn't believe that anything could ever change his situation. He'd been living with it for 38 years. He was a victim, and he had settled into his victimhood mentality. It was who he was, and he had accepted this as who he was always going to be. And I see that in people who have nursed a hurt, and they've let it affect their lives so desperately that they don't even really want to change. Even when they have the opportunity to change, even when they find out or someone tells them how they can get over this, how they can get beyond it. And this is, in fact, how this man and who this man would have always been if Jesus had not entered his life. Alfred de Souza wrote, "For a long time, it had seemed to me that life was about to begin, real life. But there's always some obstacle in the way. something to be gotten through first, some unfinished business, some time still to be served, some debt yet to be paid, and then life would begin. And he said, at last it dawned on me that these obstacles were my life. And I've come to what I believe is a similar realization regarding the church. These flawed people, these perceived obstacles to my joy, are the community that Jesus ordained for me. They are my fellowship life, my family. And waiting for them to meet my needs will leave me frustrated until I depart this planet. And blaming them for what inevitably happens in my life every day will keep me from ever being productive in my life. And that attitude will endanger not only my welfare, but it'll rub off on my kids and other people that I have any influence on, my friends. And you say, well, that's a pretty pessimistic view. I don't really think so. Because you see, I'm also one of those flawed people. And there have been too many times in my life when I've let people down, when I've not been able to meet their needs. And that's become painfully aware to me on occasions. The amount of energy invested in choosing bitterness or choosing healing is probably about the same. It requires a lot of energy and determination to stay bitter, you know. You have to keep reminding yourself of what happened. And I wonder how many people there are that wake up every morning and the first thing they think about is that hurt. They got to make sure that they keep that hurt alive. And we keep thinking about it. We don't want to lose it. Brother Clyde was in his early 80s. I was in my mid-20s. I had preached his wife's funeral a few months earlier, and she had died angry. And now I was preaching his funeral. He had written me a letter with all the details and with plenty of money to take care of everything. And he began the letter, "You're too young to understand." And then he proceeded to write about the hurt that he had in his life. He'd had it a long time. He and his wife both had. You see, he had come to my office pretty early on when I first started preaching a few years earlier to make sure that I heard his story and how badly he had been treated by someone in the church. And that incident had become the center of both of their lives for the past 30-plus years. And you could look at their face, and you could be around them for just a matter of minutes, and you would know that there was something that was wrong here. And Brother Clyde had gone to the cemetery and propped the gun on his wife's tombstone and put it in his mouth and pulled the trigger. He died angry, just like his wife did. Years earlier, they were in a really close-knit little group in the church. He was a deacon. And somebody had said something, and accompanying that had done something that had hurt their feelings deeply. And they never got over it. And they didn't want to. And I think about Brother Clyde. And I think about how tragic it is that the last 30-plus years of their life had been spent in anger, and how much they had missed out on in their life because they didn't want to get well. In fact, if you tried to talk to them about it, they became angry. They didn't want to talk about healing. They only wanted to talk about how much they had been hurt. Whenever we nurse our hurts and we hang on to the injustices that we perceive that have happened to us in this life, and maybe they were. I'm not even questioning that. But why would we waste our energy and our life on nursing a hurt? We can choose bitterness or we can choose healing. And the end results are dramatically different. One choice leaves me paralyzed by the past, and the other one gives me hope for the future. In the Christian walk, hurts are inevitable. Everybody has them. But because of Jesus Christ, feeling like a victim and deciding to stay there is optional. The story is told about a visit that Robert E. Lee paid to a lady in an antebellum-type Kentucky home, and they were on the veranda drinking refreshments. And the woman pointed to this magnificent tree, big oak tree in front of her house. And she was upset that the Union artillery had ruined the shape and the beauty of that tree. And she wanted General Lee to share her anger. She wanted him to condemn the Yankees and sympathize with her. And when she got through explaining her hurt, Lee paused and he quietly said, "Cut it down, my dear madam, and forget it." He knew that ravaged tree would only be a constant reminder of the victimhood, and so he suggested that reminder be cut down so she could get on with her life. I don't know if she did or not. I doubt it. I doubt it. We can choose to build a shrine to our pain if that's what we want to do. Have a monument that we can constantly go to and remind us all over again. But for many of us, it's time to follow the words of Robert E. Lee. Cut it down, dear brothers and sisters, and forget it, and move on with your life. Or let me put it in the phrase of a question that somebody else asked. Do you really want to get well? Do you realize that that's why Jesus came? So that you could be healed of your hurts? Do you want to be? He's the great physician. And he teaches us that the road to healing begins with, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Forgive us. Forgive those as we forgive those who have hurt us. Then forgive us. And Jesus said, come unto me, and I'll give you rest.